Welcome to the Nevin Economic Research Institute podcast. Our topic this week is Budget 2020, and I am joined by Robert Sweeney of TASC and Michelle Murphy from Social Justice Ireland. So guys, Budget 2020, a bit of a damp squib in terms of the background of Brexit, but a few takeout points, particularly in regard to welfare. Michelle, what were your main takeaway points in that area?
So the main takeaway points from Social Justice Ireland were that people on the lowest incomes were left behind. So that's people reliant on a social welfare payment and people who are on the minimum wage, because neither of them were increased in the budget, which means in real terms the value of their income is going to fall, because inflation is projected to rise by about 1.5% next year. So if you're on a fixed income, social state pension, if you're on a lone parent payment, on a job seeker's allowance, that means the real value of your payment is falling because the cost of living is increasing, and that's not taking account of the carbon tax, for example. In terms of the minimum wage, I think it was quite striking that they chose not to increase the minimum wage. The Low Pay Commission had recommended a 30-cent an hour increase. It means next year it'll be €2.50 behind the living wage. It's in stark contrast to the projected pay rises of 3% elsewhere in the economy next year. And so what it really shows that in terms of Brexit, people on low incomes weren't on the government radar. And I suppose for people on the minimum wage and on social welfare, they have only one opportunity in the year to see an increase in their living standards and an increase in their income. And that opportunity is the budget. That's the one point in the year where they can get an increase. They didn't see anything this year.
And obviously, I mean, the government's argument was that this has to be a cautious budget. But I suppose there is the danger that in constraining, the spending power of a large section of the population, that we are possibly putting ourselves in danger from that respect as well.
Well, absolutely, because that section of the population, they spend the majority of their income because they don't have the amount of disposable income to enable them to spend and save. So the money they have goes back into the economy. The second point is that, they could have made different choices. They made a particular set of choices, government, but we outlined in our budget policy briefing in June how you could increase welfare payments and how you might fund that. But government made a series of choices, but ultimately what those choices mean is that people on the lowest incomes have been left behind. They're going to fall further behind in terms of living standards, and what you will ultimately see from that, if that doesn't change next year, is a rise in poverty.
Yeah, I mean, Robert, in terms of the impact of not going for the increase in the minimum wage, I mean, we know there was already a sort of a deferment option available to firms, but to what extent do you think that was going to mitigate any of the impacts of Brexit for firms more generally?
Well, if you look at where workers who are on the minimum wage work, it's mainly the hospitality sector on the one hand and the retail sector on the other hand. Now, obviously, nobody knows what's going to happen with Brexit, and it's likely to have damaging effects on the economy in general, especially the agricultural sector. But as we were discussing just before we started this interview, the manufacturing sector as well. Now, obviously, it's not going to be good for the hospitality sector or the retail sector, but to my knowledge, people aren't really saying that those sectors are going to be among the hardest hit by Brexit. So I don't really find convincing the argument that they were refusing to raise the minimum wage based on the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission because of Brexit. I mean, I think they could have done it if there was political will to do so. You have to also bear in mind that there was legislation suggested earlier in the year by, there was a number of party support, basically, which suggested that we would have like a legal protection for workers so that they'd be able to keep their tips, which is a very small thing, but the government didn't implement it as well. So I think not raising the minimum wage is consistent with other government policies so far.
Yeah, and in terms of tax, I mean, we had seen more generally that the government decided not to go for large-scale reductions in personal taxation, and that being presented under the cautious for Brexit approach. But in terms of our taxation situation more generally, and the chatter before the budget anyway, that we are looking at some fairly serious threats to revenue base in Ireland. Did Budget 2020 have anything to speak of in that regard?
Well, basically, Budget 2020, they didn't index the tax bands. So we have inflation in the economy, and in order for people's real incomes to kind of stay the same, you need to allow for that inflation by indexing the tax bands accordingly. And that wasn't done in this current budget, which results in basically increased taxation for workers across the economy. Now, there are, to use that phrase, are storm clouds gathering. I don't have a big problem with not reducing taxes. I would certainly like to see a more progressive taxation policy than what was pursued in this budget. But I think it is prudent to not reduce taxes further, given the potential effects of Brexit, but also reform of the international system of corporate taxation. I think the damage potentially might have been done in previous budgets, whereby the government pursued a policy of reducing taxation, and that exacerbated our reliance on corporation tax, which is probably, it has a high risk of reversing itself. So, to answer your question, I don't have a huge problem with not reducing taxes in this budget, although I'd like to see, a more progressive taxation policy than what was pursued. But I would question the prudence of reducing taxation in the previous budgets.
Yes, so in a sense, a lot of the damage has been already built up.
Yeah.
Michelle, any particular tax measures which you felt sort of were out of step with what we should have seen?
Well, I suppose to start off, we would have argued against any tax cuts in this budget and previous budgets. We're on the record in many years saying we need to increase our overall tax take and broaden the base. And I suppose we do welcome the increase in stamp duty on non-commercial properties. That's something we called for. But overall, what's disappointing is you fail to see a broadening of the base, a real broadening of the base, and any sort of reform of the taxation system. So a simple thing that could have been done is a review of tax expenditures. We've called for this for a number of years. NERI itself has called for this. So even just a commitment to publish a review of every tax expenditure in advance of the budget annually, presented to the Oireachtas, show the cost of them to the state, whether or not they have sunset clauses, the impact that they are having or not having, and what the original purpose of these tax expenditures were, because they're tax foregone to the state, and a large proportion of them are potentially environmentally damaging. So I think that was incredibly disappointing, because it was an opportunity for reform that potentially could have brought in more revenue to the state, but without having a huge impact on the system as a whole. So I think that was a real lost opportunity in this budget. The second issue, as Robert pointed to, was the whole issue of corporate taxation and the international changes there. We've long been on the record looking for a minimum effective corporate tax rate, and I think ultimately that's where Ireland will have to go, given the changes in the global landscape and what is going to come out of the OECD process. So it was disappointing not to see any moves in that regard either.
Yeah, and Robert, that's when we're just talking about significant headwinds as well. We're talking about the fact that to a certain extent, most people believe our current corporation tax gain or our revenue base is a sugar high, and that we can't live in it forever. What do you think? What steps should we have taken now? I know we're probably we've been too far behind as it is, but what steps could we have taken to have averted potential danger down the track?
Well, as you mentioned, a lot of the damage was done in the previous 3 or 4 budgets by reducing taxes elsewhere, which increases our reliance on corporation tax today. I would concur with actually a proposal that Social Justice Ireland made a couple of years ago, that the windfall revenues from increases in corporation tax receipts could have been used to fund one-off capital expenditures, so that because there were one-off capital expenditures, if the receipts did eventually dry up, that those funds wouldn't have been committed to everyday current expenditure. So what they could have done is, as well as not reducing taxes elsewhere, the perhaps temporary increases in corporation tax could have been used to fund, for instance, housing programs and increase capital expenditure in housing. And then if and when those dried up, they would be able to,
It's not as much of a shock to the system.
Exactly, yeah.
And I wonder, did we miss a trick, considering that what we've used a lot of that money for has been to fund shortfalls in current expenditure in health? Should we really have been looking at putting that money into a lot of the one-off expenditures that Sláintecare would have required, and that we're no further down the road on Sláintecare than we were before, but that we've maybe missed a trick there, that was where a lot of money could have been quickly spent, but it would have reduced our exposure to the increases we keep seeing in the health budget every year.
Yes, absolutely, because Sláintecare will need an implementation budget just in terms of getting the structures off the ground. So that'll be one-off expenditure. So, and we haven't seen that budget forthcoming in the past two budgets, which is quite disappointing, because if we are to get Sláintecare off the ground and move towards that model of healthcare, if you don't put the structures in place, it'll be very difficult to roll it out, and roll it out in a fashion that means that the general public see an improvement in their access to healthcare. A concern that we would have, which you alluded to there, is the use of corporate tax revenue to plug holes in the health budget. And our concern this year is that a supplementary health budget of 320 million euros was announced, but the overrun is, I think, in the region of 500 million. So the concern for Social Justice Ireland is the first charge for the health budget in 2020 going to be to cover the rest of that overrun that the supplementary budget doesn't cover. And that will essentially come from the existing levels of service, because what was announced last week is for new initiatives in the health budget. So what the implication to us is that what has happened year on year is that when the HSE announces its operational plan next year, they'll be starting at a loss, because some of the money to cover the overrun is going to have to come from the existing level of service. So we're constantly paying catch up with health.
Really, we're running to stand still and not doing a very a good job of it.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, go on, Robert.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would, agree with Michelle on that, and that we need to really move towards Sláintecare very quickly. I think it's worth challenging the idea that the health system is just this big black hole that we keep on just shoveling money into without any returns. Yes, there's obviously issues there in terms of our procurement policy, and the National Children's Hospital is testament to that. But there's a couple of things that are worth noting. Number one, that there's been, over the past 20 years or so, there's been very significant improvements in the health of the Irish population. So life expectancy is obviously just one metric, and it's a very incomplete measure of the effectiveness of the healthcare system. But if you had to choose one metric, life expectancy probably is the best single metric. Now, Ireland lagged considerably behind other EU 15 countries around the early 1990s, but it's essentially caught up to the advanced European countries in life expectancy. And those improvements in health of the Irish population have coincided with increased investments in the health sector. So it's not the case. Obviously, there's huge problems in Ireland, and we need to move towards a more Sláintecare type model, but it's not the case that it's just one big black hole. And another thing worth noting in terms of the overspends in the health budget, IFAC, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, has repeatedly said that a lot of the projections for healthcare spending are not realistic. And if you actually look at the government's trajectory and desired trajectory of healthcare spending, I looked at it last year, I haven't done it again this year, healthcare spending as a proportion of national income, so-called GNI star, the CSO's measure, is actually set to fall a little bit over the next couple of years, despite the fact that health is a labor-intensive sector. So, if wages in the health sector are to track, general wages throughout the economy, which is what they should, it's hard to see how there could be increased improvements in the healthcare sector and wages tracking the general economy, while at the same time healthcare spending is set to fall over the next couple of years. So yes, there's definite issues with procurement, but I think some analysis needs to be done. Now, I haven't done that analysis. I would like to see some analysis done as to whether these projections in healthcare spending are actually realistic, because if you lowball, well, then you can easily turn around and say, well, the healthcare system is just ridiculously inefficient. Why would we bother move towards launch care? So I think I'd like to see some systematic analysis done on how realistic some of the actual budgets and projections are for healthcare spending.
So we could be creating a climate of a financial crisis where, in fact, it's just that we are improving and that needs extra funding.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to say in depth because I haven't actually done that analysis. And there is obviously issues there. But when the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council are also saying that a lot of these projections aren't realistic, I think we'd have to be suspicious of some of the narratives around the spending in healthcare.
Absolutely. Now, Michelle, housing was the other big issue coming up to this budget, and I think it could be most charitably described as steady as she goes, despite all the dire statistics we know that are out there already. I mean, from a Social Justice Ireland point of view, was there anything positive with regard to housing?
No, because we still are maintaining the same policy of reliance on the private sector to solve our housing crisis. So, I mean, there was we haven't met the targets that we're supposed to meet in terms of rebuilding Ireland. There was nothing in the budget to show us how we're going to meet the targets in terms of building social and affordable homes. There is an increase in the spend on emergency accommodation, but where then you look at the spend on preventing homelessness, it's minuscule in terms of the spend on emergency accommodation. You have record levels of people who are homeless. You have over 71,000 households on the social housing waiting list, and there was nothing in this budget that's going to provide social or affordable homes for people. And I suppose one of the issues now for us is that it seems that home ownership or affording a home for a single person household is almost being written out of the equation. So if you listened to any of the discussion regarding Help to Buy in advance of the budget, and we're very negative about Help to Buy, it was talking about couples buying a home. Now, over 2/4 of the people on the social housing waiting list are single adult households. Now, if an affordable home is currently, we can debate about whether this figure is right or not. We would argue that it's not. But if you look in Dublin and listen to what the minister has said, an affordable home is considered something between 300 and 320,000 euros. So if you're a single adult household, and if you are lucky enough to have the capacity to save a deposit of 30 to 32,000 euros, you need to be earning in the region of 71,000 to 82,000 euros. That's twice the average salary in order to service a mortgage on an affordable home. It's simply unsustainable. So, I mean, where are we going in terms of policy trajectory? Because if the long-term impact of this is that people are stuck in the private rental market, paying rents that they simply can't afford to pay, that's absorbing a huge amount of their disposable income. But if that continues on long term, so that these people are never going to be able to access mortgages due to their age, etc., what implications does that have for our pension system? Because our pension system is predicated on the fact that people own their homes and will not be servicing a mortgage once they reach pension age. So it's incredibly disappointing that there seems to be no strategy and no vision in terms of what we are going to do in terms of housing. It's not as if there aren't really good proposals out there from a myriad of organisations, fully costed, fully worked out proposals, but there seems to be no political will or appetite to actually implement them. And at the moment, it seems like we've reached a level of inertia that people have heard so much about the housing crisis, the rental crisis and homelessness that we're almost immune to it. And I think that's the real tragedy here.
And I think you mentioned, people putting forward different, new policy ideas. I mean, in terms of the old ones, just literally starting to build social housing again, which is something that doesn't need to be pilot tested, but the government just seems to have an aversion to this.
There's a complete aversion to the state building social housing. This is one of the areas that the state had expertise in, yet we have followed a policy since for the past 20 odd years of the state not building social housing and going to the private market to acquire that housing. Whereas the state needs to start building social housing, because not only will you reduce the waiting lists, will you reduce the number of people who are homelessness, you have an asset. Then you can begin to implement a cost rental model so you can generate an income for yourself over time as the state. But it's the state that has to go and do that. We can borrow money at record low levels of interest at the moment. We should be out there borrowing money for infrastructure projects, for housing, for broadband, for our transport infrastructure. And we should be doing that now in a period where we have high levels of growth, not in a period, we don't want to be facing down the track in a couple of years' time if there's economic upheaval and we're facing into very low levels of growth, a potential recession, and we still have the same infrastructural problems that we had 10 years ago unresolved. And how are we going to find the money then? I mean, now is the time we should be doing that. Now is the time that there should be political will to do this, yet there doesn't seem to be. And that's what's so incredibly disappointing about the budget.
Yeah, Robert, I mean, that takes us on to the point about, Michelle talking about there that this is the time for us to invest heavily in those kind of areas. I mean, in terms of where we are now, it's the budgets from 2010 onwards where we were, in free fall seemed like a long time ago, and we don't talk about budget deficits anymore. But I mean, we're still in a situation where we have a pretty large national debt. But look, what is the profile for us? I mean, we haven't talked about overheating this time round, which was the word of the day at the last budget. That's been kind of overtaken by Brexit this time round. But where are we in that respect?
Well, I think the overheating one can be wrapped up pretty quickly. They've been talking about overheating for about 3 years now, but it hasn't materialized. I think the inflation rate for 2018 was 0.7%, the consumer price index. And if you look at our employment rate as well, it hasn't recovered to the pre-crisis highs. So obviously there are some mitigating factors, as there always is. So the fact that sterling has depreciated has alleviated some of the inflationary pressures in the economy. But the fact is, there isn't any signs that the economy is overheating. Now, can we borrow going into the future? We do have high levels of national debt. So there's a couple of ways you can kind of look at this and unpack it. One, the most common measure is looking at the gross debt to GDP ratio. In Ireland, we're about in the middle among European Union countries. Now, obviously, GDP is a very flawed metric in Ireland because of the distortions caused by multinationals. But that is significant because in Ireland, we're due to move below 60% next year in terms of our debt to GDP ratio, which means that we are not violating the fiscal rules. So the fiscal rules, among other things, say that European Union governments shouldn't have a public debt to GDP ratio in excess of 60%. Now, of course, GDP isn't, as I mentioned, the best metric. And if you look at debt as a proportion of GNI star, for 2018, we were 105%, which puts us at the high end. But I don't think the level of indebtedness is the most important metric. I think it's the burden of repayment on that debt, which potentially causes a drain on resources and allocates resources towards repaying back bondholders or whatever instead of investing in needed investments. Now, if you look at that metric, we're still high among European Union countries. But looking at a snapshot in 2019 doesn't really give you a good sense, because recent years is actually unprecedented in terms of the low interest rates that prevailed throughout the global economy because of central bank actions to actually reduce interest rates through quantitative easing. if you look at Ireland through time, the repayment burden on our debt, it's about 2.6 or 2.7% of GNI star. That's about the level that persisted in 1999 when the Celtic Tiger was absolutely roaring. So I think we do have capacity to borrow, so long as we live within the fiscal rules and we don't get put on the naughty step by the European Union or the ECB. So I think the narrative around the level of indebtedness misses a lot of important points. And as Michelle mentioned, in the future, we can borrow at record low levels as well, and that our growth prospects in the medium term are actually pretty good as well. So.
And I think that's the point, because whenever in 2008, 2010, and we were saying that what the Irish economy needed then was an investment stimulus to lift it out of. But when we came around to that time, it was a sizable chunk taken out of capital expenditure anyway, and that if we are looking at troubling headwinds coming down the road, investment is something we should be looking at now, something that to guard against possible trouble further down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. So we obviously have a number of deficits in terms of our infrastructure broadly defined. So obviously housing is a massive issue, as well as the social consequences of our ridiculously high costs of accommodation. There's also economic consequences as well in terms of our competitiveness. If you look at the surveys done by the I can't remember what the body is. Anyway, there's a survey done, I think it's by the World Economic Forum, of competitiveness globally, and it surveys CEOs and other people like that. Also, Ireland has deficits in its public infrastructure as well, public transport infrastructure. So there was a recent study done which put Dublin among the most congested cities in the world, along with Rome and Rio de Janeiro. And Dublin is a medium-sized city. And then, we could go on and on about this childcare provision. Ireland has, it could do a lot better in terms of its female labour force participation as well. And so there's a lot of, if just looking at it from a pure economic perspective, obviously there's lots of other ways you can look at it. There's a lot of untapped resources there as well. So, I think we are missing a skip there when we say that our hands are tied because our levels of indebtedness are too high. I think there's low rates on our borrowing, and I think the question we should be asking ourselves is does the increases in national income and national well-being that would result from various types of investments compensate the reductions in our national income due to having to pay more interest in terms of repaying our borrowing back? And in a climate of record low borrowing rates, I think there's a strong case for public investment.
And in terms of talking about having to make investment and maybe areas where the government missed a trick, in terms of climate change, Michelle, you mentioned earlier about the impact of the carbon tax. I mean, having that small increase in the carbon tax, and obviously small increases impact different ends of society very differently, but in terms of that being the centerpiece of our response to climate change, I mean, that has to be disappointing.
Incredibly disappointing. So, I mean, you need investment not only to address your deficits, but also to plan your transition to a low carbon future. I mean, we have a national ambition, to be carbon neutral. We have a trajectory set out. We've international commitments to meet by 2030, and yet how are we going to do that if the single policy instrument we introduce is an increase in carbon tax and a commensurate €2 increase in the fuel allowance, which doesn't acknowledge the fact that the fuel allowance is a means-tested payment, and a large proportion of the people who will be most impacted by the increase in carbon tax aren't entitled to a fuel allowance, and neither do they have the alternative options available to them. So, for example, if you live outside of Dublin or Cork, Limerick, Galway or Waterford, cities where there is a public transport infrastructure in place, then how are you supposed to get to work, to school, to the shop, to a healthcare appointment. I mean, people are totally reliant on private car and private car commuting. So there was nothing in the budget, any sort of investment to provide alternatives for people, investment in public transport, investment in a national retrofitting programme of scale, which would not only provide employment, but it would also reduce energy bills and it would help us meet our commitments. And there was no investment in the national grid. Our national grid is creaking at the seams. And if we are, if we do need to increase the amount of renewable energy, if you're going to promote that to communities, they should be entitled to connect into the national grid and put whatever excess energy they create into the national grid. We don't have the infrastructure to do that. So I think it's incredibly short-sighted not to invest in these times. And Minister Donoghue said in his speech last week that climate change is the defining challenge of our generation, and yet we have made absolutely no impact on it so far. And I think what the budget did show, and we stated beforehand that, the budget will show whether government is going to pay lip service to what we need to do to move to a low carbon future, or will actually implement some of the tough decisions now, because if you don't do them now, they'll just become more difficult down the line. What we did see was just more lip service, really. None of the really tough decisions we're taking and looking at this on a sector-wide basis, looking at how you might invest. There was the announcement of the Midlands Transition Fund, which is an acknowledgement of, I suppose, the immediate impact that is going to be felt by those communities. But we knew about that impact over 10 years ago because we knew what was coming. So what's unfortunate is that there is no broader piece in there in terms of how you roll that out to other communities, where there will be impacted in terms of levels of employment, income available to people, just how we live our lives as a whole. So the thinking, there's been a couple of good reports, particularly the Oireachtas report, the Citizens Assembly, yet the recommendations from those reports don't seem to have made it into the budgetary process.
I think as well it comes to sequencing. I think when we've looked as well across at other examples, I think particularly in France, where increases in fuel tax, which are ostensibly tied to climate change, when the cost comes before the investment, that can lead to resentment and can actually almost put back any pressure for climate change. So I suppose in that regard, what should have been done for climate change in this budget, in terms of whether it's in terms of investment or whether it's in terms of funding for particular projects to begin to ease us to a more just transition?
Well, what I would say about that, without being an expert on the just transition, would, just to repeat what I said like 5 minutes ago, would be to invest in public transport.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very effective way of beginning to tackle the enormous challenge that is climate change. Public transport isn't particularly cheap in Ireland, and as I mentioned, Dublin, and not just Dublin as well, obviously there's the rest of the country as well, but it's ridiculously congested and it has quality of life issues in the here and now. And so, you can kill two birds with one stone if you actually seriously invest in public transport, and that's begin to tackle climate change, but also, improve quality of life in Dublin and also in the rest of the country
and
as well.
it's a competitiveness element.
Absolutely.
In terms of a congested city, we're paying people more.
Yeah, it was interesting. At TASC, I was talking to some people from the Dutch Central Bank recently. They were just traveling around the country and talking to various different organizations, and they noted to us that Dublin was one of the most hostile cities they've ever been to for pedestrians. That basically you don't get much time when you're crossing the roads as a pedestrian, and obviously there aren't many cycle lanes either. So it's very much the fact that our system and our cities are built around the use of cars, and they're not really facilitating either cycling or public transport use. And so I think we could tackle those issues, and I think it'd be a no-brainer, really. Of course, the sellers of cars wouldn't necessarily be all that happy about it, but I think it's worth doing.
So in terms of budget 2020, we seem to have a theme here of missed opportunities. if we could narrow it down to one policy, either that should have been reversed or one that wasn't even proposed, Michelle, what's number one?
There are a number of policies, but I will point to the policy that I think is more important to us as a country, and I think it's taxation and the fact that no real attempts were made to broaden the tax base and reform our tax system and look at how we plan. So how are we going to fund our services into the future as the population ages, as there's more pressure on certain services, the health service, for example, and there'll be more pressure on different parts of the education sector from second level on now. And how are we going to fund not only the existing levels of service, but the investment in new services, and I'm talking about current services here that will be required. So for me, I think the biggest missed opportunity, looking at our trajectory as a country, and if we want to have a vibrant and sustainable economy and society that can transition to a low carbon future, if you don't have a broad and fair tax base, then you won't get there. So for us, that's the biggest missed opportunity.
Robert?
I read a recent Eurobarometer poll which asked what are the biggest political issues facing the country, and there was two, so I can't really answer your question, but in Ireland it was the health system and the housing system. So, I think those were two of the biggest issues. Of course, there's lots of other issues that we could tackle as well. Also childcare. But if there's one thing we could reverse, I'd like to see a reversal of not raising the minimum wage.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Robert. That was a very interesting discussion. And thank you for listening to this edition of the NERI podcast. And you can follow us on Twitter at NERI Research. And if you have any suggestions for any topics you'd like to see covered in the podcast series, please email us at info@neorinstitute.net.